Right now, 450 meters beneath the churning surface of the Pacific Ocean, just 18 kilometers off the rugged coastline of Vancouver Island, a silent, titanic force is rapidly awakening. Scientists are staring at fresh data streams arriving at the Pacific Geoscience Center in Sydney, British Columbia, and what they are seeing changes everything they thought they understood about seismic and volcanic risk in Canada. This is not a slow geological process taking millennia. It is happening in catastrophic real time. For nearly 3 centuries, the seamount known as the Brooks Cone, a submerged basaltic giant hidden within the Explorer Plate boundary zone, has been dormant. But new geophysical imaging, confirmed just weeks ago, reveals a massive magma chamber beneath it is recharging at a dangerously accelerating rate. And what began in the freezing waters of January 2026 has brought the horrifying reality of a submarine explosive eruption to Canada's doorstep. We are talking about an underwater volcano that has gone unnoticed by the public, yet it is currently building toward a catastrophic pressure release that rivals historical disasters. When most Canadians think of volcanoes, they picture distant mountains in other countries, maybe Mount Baker looming on the southern horizon. But the hard scientific reality is that Canada is home to hundreds of volcanic centers, many of them beneath the ocean, and they are completely invisible until they strike. The Brooks Cone is one of the most volatile. It sits directly on a complex tectonic junction where the small Explorer Plate is subducting beneath the massive North American Plate. This is the exact geologically active plumbing system capable of generating large-scale magma accumulation over extended periods. For generations, this monster has stayed silent, but in volcanology, silence is not peace. It is a deadly accumulation of pressure, a tightly wound spring waiting to snap beneath thousands of feet of water, capable of displacing massive amounts of ocean in an instant. The chronology of this brewing crisis is as meticulously documented as it is terrifying. For decades, Natural Resources Canada, NRCAN, had been trying to answer one central question about the Explorer Ridge systems. How much magma is actively accumulating beneath these submerged cones? The answer they finally found, using advanced seismic tomographic imaging, exceeded every dark expectation. The data, published in a startling internal report by the Geological Survey of Canada in late 2025, utilized full waveform inversion technology, a geological X-ray that revealed a magma chamber previously completely unknown. This hidden reservoir extends from 3 to 6 kilometers beneath the seafloor, measuring approximately 800 meters wide. The total volume of accumulated molten rock exceeds 1.6 cubic kilometers. To put that into perspective, that is enough molten material at temperatures exceeding 1100 degrees Celsius to fill over 640,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Even more alarming is the revealed inflation rate. The chamber has been expanding by nearly 5 million cubic meters every single year since accurate records began. Dr. Aris Thorne, a senior geophysicist with NRCan, stated in the report, "If this injection rate holds, the Brooks Cone will reach its critical saturation threshold, the same pressure level that triggered its last massive explosive event in the early 1700s, within the next 24 to 36 months. We are monitoring a volcano actively recharging for a full-scale eruption." Then, at 4:12 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on January 19, 2026, the theoretical risk became an immediate, critical emergency. Seismographs along the coast registered an unexpectedly intense sequence of earthquakes beginning directly beneath the Brooks Cone. Over the course of the following 30 days, NRCan's Canadian National Seismograph Network registered over 32,000 seismic events. This was not a routine swarm. It was a concentrated, violent fracturing of the crust, never before documented with this intensity in Canadian waters. The largest event reached magnitude 5.4. On February 3, 2026, Public Safety Canada, in coordination with the BC Provincial Emergency Coordination Centre, declared a limited state of emergency for coastal regions. BC ferries suspended key routes as the ground shook. Evacuation advisories were issued for low-lying areas of Tofino and Ucluelet as the threat of a co-seismic landslide or submarine eruption creating a tsunami became acute. By March, an estimated 15,000 coastal residents and seasonal workers had voluntarily evacuated. International monitoring teams were deployed to the region to assist, monitoring data streams around the clock. The current situation remains critical as the volcanic plumbing is clearly activated and the countdown has begun. The historical parallels that keep Canadian volcanologists awake at night are chillingly precise. While many Canadians look to foreign disasters for context, the most terrifying template is indigenous to this coast. The massive, albeit terrestrial, eruption of Tseax Cone in northwestern British Columbia around 1775 stands as a grim testament. That event unleashed parallelistic flows and lethal, heavier-than-air volcanic gases that snaked down the valley, wiping out 2 entire Nishga villages and killing an estimated 2,000 people. It remains one of Canada's worst natural disasters. The Brooks Cone, however, is a submarine threat, and its scale makes it arguably more dangerous than Tseax. The 2022 Hungatonga-Hunga Ha'apai eruption in the South Pacific demonstrated the catastrophic power of a submarine explosive event. That eruption generated an atmospheric pressure wave that circled the globe and sent tsunami waves 20 meters high, crashing into nearby islands. The Brooks Cone sits just 18 kilometers from Canada's critical coastal infrastructure and major shipping lanes. The forecast models for a full-scale Brooks eruption are horrifying. An explosive decompression beneath 450 meters of water could trigger a massive submarine landslide of the cone's fragile, water-saturated flanks. The resulting tsunami would reach the communities of Tofino, Ucluelet, and Port Alberni in under 20 minutes. In the most extreme modeled scenario, wave heights exceeding 15 meters could impact populated coastal areas with almost zero warning time. Furthermore, a scientific bombshell was dropped in May 2026 when a collaborative study from Ocean Networks Canada and the University of British Columbia revealed that the Brooks Cone is not an isolated structure. Deep seismic imaging shows it is geologically coupled with the larger submerged Endeavour segment via a shared deep crustal magmatic reservoir. They are 2 massive volcanic systems breathing in synchrony, exchanging pressure across an invisible underground connection that had existed all along. The research, which analyzed the recent swarm data using AI tools, concluded that sheets of magma had cut through the crust over an area of 25 kilometers. The magnitude of this coupled system significantly elevates the entire risk profile for future activity across the North Pacific corridor. The human cost and logistical chaos of this ongoing geophysical crisis are staggering, painted in raw data and the harrowing stories of those on the front lines. The January and February seismic swarm didn't just rattle nerves, it caused tangible, widespread destruction. In the communities of Tofino and Ucluelet, the shaking felt near continuous, leading to a profound psychological toll. Local authorities received hundreds of reports of cracked foundations and structural damage. BC Hydro reported repeated localized power outages as lines snapped and transformers failed due to the unprecedented ground movement. Total infrastructure damage estimates for Vancouver Island from the seismic activity alone already exceed 350 million Canadian dollars. The ecological impact is also severe. Unique deep-water sponge reefs near the seamount were shattered by the intense earthquake activity, and local fisheries reported significant shifts in salmon migration patterns as the underwater environment became hostile and acoustic stress surged. Consider the experience of Captain Elias Dubois of the research vessel Neptune's Horizon, which was near the Brooks Cone deploying monitoring equipment when the magnitude 5.4 event struck. Dubois described the scene. It wasn't like a normal earthquake on land. the whole ocean felt wrong. We were hit by a series of powerful vertical jolts, like we were hitting a concrete wall repeatedly. The water column was violently agitated, and we saw localized upwelling of discolored, sediment-choked water. My crew has worked around earthquakes before, but this felt apocalyptic. The economic ripple effects extend far beyond the coast. The port of Vancouver, which handles a significant portion of Canada's trade with Asia, has been operating under elevated risk protocols. The potential closure of critical shipping lanes due to a sudden tsunami risk from a submarine eruption is a national security concern. The major rail lines connecting BC ports to the rest of Canada are vulnerable to landslide blockages triggered by coastal shaking. Public Safety Canada is coordinating with cellular providers to ensure emergency alerts function, but the extreme remote location of the volcanic center limits real-time data transmission, adding seconds to critical warning windows that could cost lives. The logistical reality is that we are struggling to manage the mere prelude to a potential full-scale eruption. The actual event would dwarf all current emergency responses. As we look to the immediate future, the reality of the situation is undeniably alarming. What is happening beneath the waters of Vancouver Island is one of the most significant ongoing geological stories of our generation, and it is nowhere near finished. It involves ancient tectonic forces operating on timescales we can barely comprehend, hidden volcanic systems that contain more energy than a multi-megaton nuclear device, and millions of Canadians living, working, and traveling within range of these massive structures every single year. The immediate threat as we head into 2027 is the Brooks Cone's continued recharge. The critical pressure threshold is approaching with statistical certainty. This coupled volcanic system, breathing in synchrony, means a future event may not be isolated. An eruption at the Brooks Cone could trigger activity elsewhere in the Explorer Ridge complex or on Vancouver Island itself, potentially impacting hydroelectric plants and regional power grids across the province. Critical ports like Prince Rupert and the massive pipelines and terminals of the BC energy sector, while further north, are still within the modeled impact zone of a large-scale trans-Pacific tsunami that could be generated by a major edifice collapse on the Brooks Seamount. The strategic importance of these economic corridors cannot be overstated, yet their vulnerability is now glaringly obvious. I will keep following every new study, every new piece of seismic data that comes out of the Pacific Geoscience Center and NRCan, because this is a developing, dynamic story with a finite ticking clock, and the next, perhaps final chapter could arrive at any moment. If this video gave you a clearer, scientifically accurate picture of the volcanic monsters hidden beneath Canada's waters, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next urgent update. New content based on verified Canadian scientific sources goes up every week, and if you know someone living on the West Coast, working in the maritime industry, or someone who is simply fascinated by the raw, untamed power of our planet, share this video with them. Because in geology, as in life, awareness is always the first and most vital line of defense against the tectonic fury. At exactly 7:22 a.m. on February 14, 2026, the automated alert systems at the Pacific Geoscience Center in Sydney, British Columbia, triggered a level red notification. Seismographs located at a focal depth of 12 kilometers beneath the Brooks Cone, just off the northwestern tip of Vancouver Island, detected a shift in seismic frequency that volcanologists characterize as the death rattle of a dormant system. This wasn't the sharp, jagged signature of tectonic plates grinding past one another. These were harmonic tremors, long, low-frequency oscillations caused by the high-pressure movement of molten rock through narrow subterranean conduits. The data was unequivocal. Magma was no longer just accumulating, it was migrating. The technical resolution of this crisis began months earlier, in late 2025, when a team from the Geological Survey of Canada aboard the research vessel CCGS John P. Tally deployed a cutting-edge imaging technique known as full waveform inversion, FWI. Think of it as a multi-billion pixel medical ultrasound, but instead of scanning a human body, it scans the Earth's crust. By firing high-energy sound waves into the Pacific floor and measuring the precise microsecond delays as they bounced back, researchers constructed a three-dimensional map of the Brooks Cone's interior, with a resolution never before achieved in Canadian maritime history. What they saw sent shock waves through Natural Resources Canada. The imaging revealed a massive, active magma chamber, sitting between 2 and 4 kilometers below the seafloor. It is a cavern of liquid fire, roughly 700 meters wide, containing an estimated 1.4 cubic kilometers of magma, enough to bury the city of Victoria under 5 meters of molten basalt. But it was the inflation data that turned concern into terror. High-precision GNSS stations, located along the rugged coastline near Port Ellis and Winter Harbor, registered a sustained 12-centimeter westward offset over a period of just 3 weeks. The ground wasn't just shaking. The entire continental shelf was being pushed and deformed by the sheer force of magmatic injection. The reservoir was recharging at a rate of 4.2 million cubic meters per year, a pace that has been accelerating exponentially since the last major seismic swarm of 2024. Dr. Elena Vance, a lead geophysicist with the Geological Survey of Canada, noted in a leaked internal memo, "The mechanical integrity of the overlying crust is reaching its brittle ductile transition limit. The pressure within the Brooks Reservoir is currently exceeding the lithostatic load of the ocean above it. We are no longer looking at a if scenario, but a when, and that when appears to be measured in months, not decades." The vulnerability of Canada's Pacific infrastructure cannot be overstated. The Brooks Cone sits directly adjacent to the Neptune Observatory, a 800-kilometer loop of fiber optic cables and sensors that form the backbone of our deep-sea monitoring. During the peak of the February 2026 unrest, thermal sensors on the seafloor recorded a localized temperature spike of 14 degrees Celsius in the bottom-dwelling waters, an impossible anomaly unless hydrothermal vents were being superheated by a shallowing magma body. This heat is not just a biological threat. It risks melting the protective casing of the trans-Pacific telecommunications cables that connect Canada to Asian markets. Further complicating the crisis is the coupled system discovery made by researchers at the University of Victoria. Using artificial intelligence to analyze over 25,000 micro-earthquakes, they determined that the Brooks Cone is geologically tethered to the larger Explorer Ridge system through a shared mid-crustal magmatic highway. This means an eruption at Brooks wouldn't be an isolated event. It could trigger a chain reaction of slope failures and secondary eruptions across the maritime boundary. The geological plumbing is interconnected, a vast network of pressurized dikes and sills cutting through the Canadian crust like a ticking clock. As the magma continues to redistribute, the seafloor above the cone has already begun to subside in the center, while the flanks bulge outward, a classic precursor to a caldera-forming explosive event. The tension in the Pacific Geoscience Center is palpable. Every second of data brings them closer to a reality that Canada has not faced in recorded history. To comprehend the sheer scale of the threat looming off the British Columbia coast, we must look into Canada's dark geological past, specifically to a period roughly 300 years ago that rewritten the oral histories of the Nuu-chah-nulth and Kwakwaka'wakw peoples. While the Great Cascadia earthquake of 1700 is well documented, Geological Survey of Canada researchers have recently uncovered evidence of a localized secondary catastrophe in the marine sediment record dating to approximately 1720. Core samples designated V2024-09, extracted from the basin floor surrounding the Brooks Cone, reveal a massive layer of tephra and glass shards consistent with a shallow water phreatomagmatic explosion. This wasn't just an earthquake, it was the boiling sea event described in indigenous traditions, where the ocean itself was said to have turned to steam, accompanied by a wave that swallowed the trees. This historical parallel is the ghost that haunts the current monitoring data. The science of the Brooks cone is defined by a terrifying cyclicity. Based on the 2025 full waveform inversion data, the GSC has established a critical volume threshold for this specific magmatic system. Every 300 to 350 years, the reservoir beneath the cone reaches a state of overpressure where the lithostatic weight of 450 meters of seawater is no longer sufficient to keep the system capped. We are currently at year 306. According to the Brooks Explorer volcanic forecast model, updated in early 2026, the current volume of 1.4 cubic kilometers of magma is within 85% of the estimated volume expelled during the 1720 disaster. The volcano is effectively a pressure cooker that has been left on high heat for 3 centuries, and the safety valve is about to fail. The tectonic twist that scientists discovered in May 2026 involves a phenomenon known as system coupling. Using long-range ocean bottom seismometers, OBS, researchers from Natural Resources Canada and the University of British Columbia identified a deep-seated magmatic siphon connecting the Brooks cone to the Delwood Knolls to the north and the larger Explorer Ridge complex. They are not separate volcanoes, they are separate vents of a single, massive subcrustal furnace. When the Explorer plate subducts at a steep angle beneath Vancouver Island, it creates a tectonic squeeze, forcing magma into the Brooks Reservoir at an accelerating rate. This isn't a slow trickle, it's a high-pressure injection. The May 2026 report, titled Intersegment Connectivity and Magmatic Overpressure in the Canadian Pacific, notes that the ground inflation at Brooks is perfectly synchronized with deep-seated tremors 40 kilometers away. Two giants are breathing in unison, and the pressure redistribution suggests a domino effect scenario. If the Brooks cone erupts, the primary mechanism of destruction won't be lava, it will be the cold water flash. When 1100 degrees Celsius magma hits 4 degrees Celsius seawater at a depth of 450 meters, the water doesn't just boil, it flashes into steam instantly, expanding its volume by a factor of 1600. This is the trigger for a volcanic explosivity index VEI4 event. The resulting shock wave would displace billions of tons of water. GSC tsunami simulations conducted in June 2026 show that a flank collapse of just 15% of the cone would generate a Canadian tsunami with an initial wave height of 22 meters. This wall of water would reach the surf town of Tofino in 14 minutes. Port Alberni, situated at the end of a long, narrowing inlet, would see the funnel effect amplify the surge to catastrophic levels, potentially reaching 30 meters. Statistics provided by Public Safety Canada estimate that a Brooks eruption during peak tourism season could impact over 100,000 people along the coastal corridor. The economic forecast models are equally green. The disruption of the Pacific Gateway shipping lanes, the primary arteries for Canada's trade with the Asia-Pacific region, could cost the Canadian economy 1.2 billion Canadian dollars per day. The Trans-Pacific fiber optic cables, which handle 90% of Western Canada's international data traffic, run directly through the predicted debris flow path. We are looking at a total blackout of data, trade, and physical safety. The cyclicity is no longer a theoretical debate among academics. It is a mathematical certainty that the clock is running out on the 300-year piece. The human cost of the January and February 2026 seismic crisis was not just measured in Richter scales or millimetric ground offsets, but in the frantic reality of a coastline under siege. For 30 days, the people of Vancouver Island lived through a relentless bombardment of more than 30,000 recorded earthquakes, a sequence that paralyzed the local economy and tested the limits of Canada's emergency infrastructure. Dr. Sarah Desjardins, a lead seismologist at the Pacific Geoscience Center in Sydney, described the atmosphere inside the monitoring station as combat-like. We weren't just looking at dots on a map anymore. We were looking at the live disintegration of the stable crust of our shores, she stated in a March 2026 briefing. Every 15 minutes, a new cluster of magnitude 3 or 4 events would light up the screens. We knew the magma was moving, cutting through the rock like a hot knife through wax, and we had to tell 11,000 people to leave their homes without knowing if they'd have a town to return to. In the coastal community of Tofino, the impact was visceral. Liam Chen, a structural inspector for the district of Tofino, spent the height of the crisis documenting the slow-motion collapse of local infrastructure. Highway 4, the only terrestrial lifeline connecting the west coast of the island to the rest of Canada, was repeatedly shattered due to rockfalls at Kennedy Lake and the Sutton Pass. The ground wouldn't stop vibrating, Chen recalled. It wasn't the big hits that did the most damage. It was the seismic fatigue. Foundations that had stood for 50 years were developing spiderweb cracks. We had to advise residents to drain their swimming pools immediately. It sounds strange, but the sloshing effect of thousands of liters of water during constant tremors can actually destabilize a building's entire footprint. We were essentially watching the ground liquefy in slow motion. By mid-February 2026, the BC Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, EMCR, coordinated the largest voluntary evacuation in the province's history. Over 11,000 residents and seasonal workers from the Long Beach area were funneled through inland reception centers in Port Alberni and Nanaimo. The economic hemorrhage was staggering. Public Safety Canada estimates the total provincial loss during the 60-day emergency period at $1.85 billion Canadian dollars. This includes the total shutdown of the Pacific salmon fishery, the cancellation of 3 months of international tourism bookings, and the emergency deployment of the Royal Canadian Navy's Pacific Fleet to maintain a safety corridor around the Brooks Cone. Perhaps the most haunting account came from Marcus Blackwater, a commercial fisherman and member of the Tlaukiat First Nation. On February 12, while pulling traps near the edge of the continental shelf, he witnessed a phenomenon that had only been described in oral histories. The water didn't just ripple, it hummed, Blackwater said. About 10 kilometers out, we saw a massive patch of the ocean turn a sickly, milky turquoise, the color of glacial silt. Then, the dead fish started surfacing by the thousands. Deep-water rockfish, species we never see on the surface, were floating everywhere. The sonar on my boat went haywire, showing the seafloor rising and falling by meters in a matter of hours. We didn't wait for the radio alert. We turned that boat around and headed for the inlet as fast as the engine would take us. The logistical nightmare extended to the power grid. BC Hydro reported that the constant ground acceleration caused specialized seismic dampers on high-voltage lines near Campbell River to fail under the strain, leading to rolling blackouts that affected 45,000 customers. Telecom giants Telus and Rogers reported significant data lag as the Neptune underwater fiber optic nodes were physically displaced by the 32-centimeter seafloor subsidence recorded above the Brooks Cone. Canada's digital connection to the Pacific was fraying at the seams. As the magma redistributed between the Brooks and Explorer reservoirs, the surface of Vancouver Island itself was caught in a geological tug-of-war, parts of the coast rising 10 centimeters while the seafloor dropped. A silent, terrifying exchange of pressure that suggests the worst is yet to come. The crisis of 2026 proved that our modern, high-tech society is built on a foundation of sand, and the giant beneath the waves has only just begun to stir. As we look toward 2027 and beyond, the scientific community is no longer debating whether the Brooks Cone will erupt, but rather how much of the Canadian Pacific Shelf it will take with it when it does. What is happening beneath the Mediterranean-like beauty of the British Columbia coast is one of the most significant ongoing geological stories of our generation. It involves ancient tectonic forces operating on timescales we can barely comprehend, and hidden volcanic systems that contain more energy than the largest stockpiles of conventional explosives. The events of 2026 were not an isolated incident. They were the opening salvo of a new era of volcanic unrest in the North Pacific. The coupled system data discovered during the height of the crisis has fundamentally rewritten the risk profile for Western Canada. Projections for 2027 and 2028 indicate that the magmatic intrusion has not retreated. Instead, the shared deep crustal reservoir between the Brooks Cone and the Explorer Ridge is continuing to inflate. Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, has released a 2027 to 2030 strategic risk assessment, estimating that a full-scale caldera-forming event at Brooks could result in a total economic impact exceeding 42 billion Canadian dollars. This figure accounts for the potential destruction of the Roberts Bank superport and the permanent disruption of the Ridley terminals in Prince Rupert due to transoceanic tsunami waves. The vulnerability of our Pacific Gateway is no longer a theoretical concern for economists. It is a live tactical problem for Public Safety Canada. The infrastructure risks extend deep into the heart of British Columbia. A major submarine eruption would likely be accompanied by a magnitude 6.5 or higher earthquake, a trigger event that could destabilize the weak clay layers of the Fraser River Delta. This would put the Vancouver International Airport and the Massey Tunnel at extreme risk of liquefaction-induced failure. Furthermore, BC Hydro's northern transmission lines, which provide the bulk of the province's power, sit atop terrain that is increasingly sensitive to the regional seismic swarm activity radiating from the Explorer Plate boundary. We are looking at a scenario where a single volcanic vent 18 kilometers offshore could effectively decapitate the power, transport, and telecommunications nodes of an entire province. But science is not standing still in the face of this inevitability. In December 2026, the Canadian Coast Guard vessel CCGS Sir John Franklin departed on the Deep Frontier expedition to the Brooks Cone. Their mission is to deploy the most advanced submarine monitoring technology ever seen in the Arctic or Pacific. Borehole tiltmeters and high-temperature seismographs installed directly into the volcano's crater walls at a depth of 500 meters. This new Vancouver Island Volcanic Observatory, VIVO, provides a level of real-time data access that simply did not exist 3 years ago. We are now able to track the movement of individual magma fingers as they migrate toward the seafloor, giving us a reaction window measured in hours rather than minutes. The trajectory of this geological event is accelerating. The data from early 2027 shows that the seafloor above the Brooks Cone is continuing to deform at a rate of 3 centimeters per month. This is the breathing of a giant that is waking up after a 300-year sleep. The most important dimension of everything discussed is that the data does not lie, and it does not care about our schedules or our economies. The Brooks Cone is recharging, the pressure is mounting, and the tectonic plumbing of the Canadian Pacific is reaching its breaking point. I will keep following every new study from the Geological Survey of Canada and every telemetry ping from the Ocean Networks Canada sensors, because this is a story that is still developing, and the next chapter, the explosive chapter, could arrive at any time. If this video gave you a clearer picture of the volatile giants hidden beneath our waters, subscribe and turn on notifications. New content based on verified Canadian scientific sources goes up every week.